Hey, it's Art from My New Microphone. Let's talk about achieving three-dimensional mixes, notably in the dimensions of width, height, and depth. Now, I did a video previously where I go into depth on these three dimensions. I'll leave a card up in the top if you'd like to check that one out for a primer on what we will be discussing in this. But essentially, we will be discussing those three dimensions. The dimension of height basically refers to the frequency content of the mix, what sounds are deep in the low end, what sounds are up top in the high end, and what sounds make up the mid-range to get a great balance across the height or the frequency spectrum. We'll talk about width, which is essentially the difference between the left and right channels in a stereo mix, although we can also extrapolate this out to surround sound systems such as 5.1 or 7.1 or Dolby Atmos. And we will be discussing depth, which is essentially the perceived distance between different sound sources and the listener. And before we hop into Logic Pro to have a look and listen to how to make three-dimensional mixes, I want to talk about a key point for developing our framework for three-dimensional mixes, and that is contrast. Much like we can't have loud without quiet, we can't have close elements without distance elements in the field of depth, we can't have wide elements without narrow elements in the field of width, and we can't have high elements without low elements in the field of height. So keep contrast in mind when thinking about three dimensions in mixing. It is an extremely important point as everything is in reference or relation to something else. Once again, we can't have wide without narrow, deep without shallow, or tall without short. So with that in mind, let's hop into Logic Pro. All right, here we are inside of Logic Pro to dive deeper into the concept of three-dimensional mixing and have a look and listen at how we can go about doing that. So let's start off with the dimension of width because I think that that's the easiest one to wrap our heads around. And we will start actually with my voice and the most important tool that we have for width, and that is panning. So once again, the width of a stereo mix at least is the difference between the left and the right channels. And we have panning right here, which I can take my voice and move it all the way to the left channel or all the way to the right channel or anywhere in between and achieve a sense of directionality across the stereo panorama, which will ultimately lead to width. So let's go back to mono. And when I'm panned in the center, I have equal energy in the left and right, so it is perceived as being in mono. And again, if I pan it all the way to the left, then you'll only hear me on the left side, and all the way to the right side. So taking the incredibly important tool of panning and combining it with the concept of contrast, we can see how LCR panning can be an extremely valuable way of panning for width. LCR panning stands for left, center, right panning, where elements are either panned hard left, much like this reverb send right here, to the center, like my vocal, or all the way to the right, like this reverb return right here. So you may be tempted to pan things intermediately between the extremes, but this doesn't lead to a great sense of contrast and can therefore lead to a narrowing of the mix, even though we technically have more information panned around the stereo spectrum. So in this mix, you'll see that I have most of my elements panned to the center. A lot of these tracks are stereo. We'll get to that momentarily. But anything that is not panned to the center is pretty well panned hard left or hard right, other than these hats right here and this china right here, which are samples that I laid in. And I just thought I would push them a little bit out of center to give that sense of a kit. So for example, this overhead right here is a stereo track, which has an audio file on the left channel and the right channel. And depending on the microphone placement of those two channels, a symbol all the way to the left of the kit will be much more represented in the left channel versus a symbol all the way on the right will be much more represented in the right channel, and the symbols in the middle will be more so represented in the center. So that's kind of the idea behind these samples right here, and they're panning just slightly off center. But for the most part, I am using LCR panning, and for the most part, I stick to LCR panning in my mixes for that reason of developing a nice width in the mix. So with contrast, we want a strong center image, as well as a lot of great stuff on the sides to really have that contrast and width in the mix. So let's have a quick listen and focus on the width of this mix. Another great way of achieving a sense of width is to use delay in stereo. So right here, I have a stereo delay effects return. I have my Logic stock stereo delay right here with no feedback. We have a delay time of 180 milliseconds on the left, 220 milliseconds on the right, and I'm feeding several tracks to bus 13 to feed this delay right here. So let's have another listen, and I will bring this stereo delay up and down in the mix, and we can have a listen to how it affects the width. So you can hear it particularly in that lead guitar, that whammied guitar that I'm playing with the arpeggio. As I bring this up, it really spreads that guitar out into the stereo spectrum while still maintaining a strong center image because that guitar is panned to the center right here. So we have an instance where the lead guitar right here is panned straight up the center. So we have a strong mono representation of that signal. And then we are also sending it to bus 13 and getting a bit of width on that via this stereo delay. So once again. There are other instruments being fed into the stereo delay as well, but I just wanted to hone in on this lead guitar right here, the Guitar Disto 3, as that really helps add a little bit more space in the stereo width from a mono source. But we don't only use stereo effects for this reason. We can also utilize something called the Haas effect, which relies on delay. Let's solo out this synth right here and open up this Haas delay. And I have a video on the Haas effect. I'll leave a link to that in the description box down below. But effectively what it is we delay one source versus another within about 40 milliseconds. And what happens is we still perceive that source as being a single source. However, the directionality of that source will be of the first perceived sound, and the second perceived sound, or the delayed version of that sound, will just help to give a sense of dimensionality to that. So let's have a listen to this synth in solo, and I will mess around with the Haas effect, turning it on and off, so we can see how a stereo delay can be used to really increase the width of an individual sound. So you can hear that it is stereo, but this Haas effect that has a little bit of delay to the right will really push it out even further into the stereo image. So I didn't actually end up using this in the mix because I found that this synth needed more of that mono compatibility rather than being super wide, but I just wanted to show you this in this video. All right, another cool way of adding to the width of a mix is to use doubling. And so we can see this in the guitars up here. I have one guitar panned all the way to the left, one guitar panned all the way to the right. These are actually playing harmonies of each other, so it's not real doubling, but having a guitar or another instrument playing essentially the same part or a harmony with the same rhythm and panning one hard left and one hard right can really give a sense of width to the mix. So let's have a listen to that. So just having those panned to the opposite sides, the opposite extremes, can really fill out that stereo image while also making room for the important elements that are in the center, such as the kick, the snare, the bass, so on and so forth. You'll see here also that I am sending the guitar that is panned all the way to the left to bus 16, which is my guitar verb R, or guitar verb right. And then I have the guitar panned all the way to the right, sending to bus 15, which is guitar verb L. This is a trick I like using. It's an opposite side delay where we go over here and we have 15 and 16, and we have a spring reverb right here. This is the soft tube spring reverb, and this is in mono, and I have the effects return panned to the opposite side of the track that is feeding it. So just a neat little technique I like using in my mixes just to help fill out that stereo image that much more. In addition to actually doubling up the tracks in recording, we can also use doubler effects. I'm a big fan of the Waves doubler, and what we can do is go back to this lead guitar right here, and I will put on the Waves doubler. I didn't feel the need to use it because, again, we have that delay, but in this case, let's mute these delay sends so that we just have a mono source. And now we can turn on this doubler. And what we have here is our direct signal that we can toggle on and off with gain, pan, and then we have our voice 1 and voice 2. So we see that we are effectively adding 2 more voices to this signal, both of which are at -6 dB. One of them is panned all the way to the left. One of them is panned all the way to the right. See that -45 and +45 right here. We have a delay time, so they are being delayed from one another, which is similar to the Haas effect. And then we also have detune right here, which is very important. So we are detuning by +6 cents on the left and -6 cents on the right. So in this case, we get a bit of stereo delay and also a bit of stereo detuning to really fill out the stereo image right here. So I'll play this back and toggle this effect on and off. So you hear how that just really gives a sense of width to the track within the mix. I'll actually leave this doubler on because we still have a very strong center image right here. I may turn this gain down, let's say -9, just so that it's not super apparent, but we still get a little bit of extra width, and I'll turn these delay sends back on. Another way of achieving width in the mix is to actually use mid-side processing. So if we go back to this synth right here, you can see that I have this channel EQ. This is Logic's channel EQ, the stock one. And right down here in processing, I can process the mid only. So right here, I'm adding a bit of 202 Hertz to the signal, only in the middle channel, while I'm taking away a lot around the 2000 Hertz range, again, only in the mid channel. I have a video dedicated to mid-side processing. I will leave a link to that in the description box down below. But I have that one, and then I have another channel EQ right here where I am processing the sides only. So here you can see that there's a big high pass filter, and I'm cutting some around 174, and then I'm boosting at around 1500 right here. So let's play this back in solo, and I will bypass each of these EQs to hear the difference. So you hear that the higher frequencies are pushed out a little bit into the sides, while the strong mids are being pushed more in the center. You may need headphones to really hear this. It's subtle, but it can really help make the frequency content that I'd like in the mids more apparent, and the frequency content that I want on the sides more apparent as well. Now, I'm doing a lot of this mixing in solo just as a demo. I wouldn't recommend mixing in solo. I did all of these moves in the context of the mix. However, I just really want to hone in on each of these strategies for width, and the best way of doing that would be to listen in solo. All right, I would be remiss if I didn't mention stereo imaging plugins, and you can see here on this synth, I have one. However, with this, I am actually reducing the width, so I'm narrowing the signal rather than widening it. And that's an important thing to consider when we're mixing too. Again, taking things back to contrast. If everything is wide, then nothing's wide. And where this is such an important element in the overall mix, I decided that having it pulled a little bit more into the center image would make it that much better in the greater context of the mix, especially when summing the mix to mono for mono compatibility's sake. We can go to other instruments, such as this electric guitar that is present in the intro. Have a listen to this. And again, with this one, I am narrowing it as well. And in the context of the mix, and my thinking right here, getting back to contrast in the sense of the long-term dynamics of the mix, was I wanted to make this guitar a bit more narrow, and then the guitar that is effectively playing the same part would be wider when the entire mix came in. So if we have a listen back, you can hear this guitar widen up as the full mix comes in. So it's narrow when the mix is sparser right here, and then as the mix opens up and all the other instruments come in, that guitar gets spread out wider to help widen out the mix and make it that much more exciting, but also to make room in the center image for other elements. And another track in which I am using the Waves S1 is this Guidebook right here. We can see that I'm actually automating this. So it starts off narrow in the first half of the mix, and then it actually widens up wider than it would be originally halfway through. So if we have a listen to this, So just a little bit of automation to open that up to make the mix get wider as the song progresses and just add a little bit more excitement. And the big issue I have with stereo imaging plugins is that it can really sound unnatural to push things too far outside of the boundaries of the stereo limits. So for the purposes of this demo, I wanted to use quite a bit of stereo imaging. However, in the actual context of the mix, you found that I was really using it to narrow tracks more than I was to make things wider. However, one way that I like to use stereo imaging is actually in parallel processing. So going back to this synth right here, we can solo that. And you see here that I'm sending it to bus 21, para width. If we go over to bus 21 over here, we see that we have inserts right here on this effects return that have a micro shift that is similar to a chorusing effect where it produces additional copies of the original signal, detunes the copies and delays them to really focus them out in the stereo spectrum. So we have that. We have a stereo imager, which is pushing things way out wide. And then we have a linear EQ, which is pushing that side information up around 600 hertz here. So this processing is somewhat extreme, but because I'm doing it on a parallel channel and not directly on the synth itself, we can kind of get away with it. So let's have a listen to what this sounds like. So it just helps enhance that stereo image that much more. So there's a whole bunch of different strategies we have for increasing the perceived width of a mix. These are just a few that I wanted to show you in this particular mix that I'm working on right now. But you can learn these and many more and bring those techniques and concepts into your mixes to achieve better width. Let's move on quickly to height. Now, height is a little bit strange because as humans with ears on the sides of our heads, we don't really hear things as being tall versus short as much as we do hearing them left to right. Of course, we can hear birds in the sky versus earthquakes in the ground, let's say, but we're really more concerned with directionality in the panorama around us. That said, when we are working with the dimension of height in the mix, we can look at low end as being the low part of height and the very high end as being the high point of height. It's in the language and the mid-range making up the majority of the mix here. So in order to have a nice balanced mix, we want a nice balanced frequency spectrum. And that is mostly to do with arrangement, but it also has to do with EQ, compression, and setting levels. So if we have a listen to this mix, we can hear that it's relatively balanced. We have the bass in the low end, that synth that we've been focusing on a lot in the low mids to cover that. We've got cymbals up in the high end, and then guitars, other synths, and other instruments like these pads and flutes that are filling up that mid-range. So there's not really a whole lot I have to say on height. It's kind of the dimension that mostly takes care of itself throughout the mix. One thing I will mention though is that it's important not to overdo the bass frequencies. So you'll see here that I only have one bass track. And I have my gain for gain staging, and then the Pro Q3 by FabFilter, and you can see that I'm taking out a significant amount of low end. And then I have the FabFilter Saturn to really help bring up the presence of this track with some saturation, particularly in the mid-range. But if I'm to toggle this EQ on and off in the context of the mix, you'll hear that the sub really gets overbearing quickly when the low end is not tamed with this EQ. So you heard there that when this EQ was bypassed, the sub bass, if you can hear it, was really overbearing, and it still may be a little bit too much. I will have to take this out of the studio and really reference on a playback system that can really reproduce those frequencies to really hear that. But it's really important to get the low end right in terms of the height dimension, as well as not overdoing it on the high end either. And if we find ourselves mixing for a very long time, the high end is the first frequency band to really go in terms of ear fatigue. And so the longer we mix, the more we may want to increase the high end. So it's important to take breaks because you may return to the mix the next day and realize that the high end is way too much. So that's another thing to watch out for. And then of course we have the all important mid-range, which is arguably the most important part to get right. for mix translatability and for overall mix quality. And that basically comes down to just balancing things and mixing things properly on your system in your studio. If you're finding the tips and concepts in this video helpful thus far, I would encourage you to hit that like button. It'll help get this information out in front of more people. I appreciate that. All right, and moving on to our third dimension in our discussion of 3D mixing, we have depth. Now, the primary tool for creating depth in a mix is the fader. So we had panning for the primary tool for width, and we have the fader for the primary tool for depth. And the easiest way to explain this is if something or somebody is close to you making noise, it will sound louder than if it's further away. It's just how we hear sound, and so we should take this into account when we are mixing. And again, contrast is important, so we should have things that are quiet in the mix and things that are louder in the mix. Mixing is not necessarily about making sure that every element is clearly heard throughout the entirety of the mix. It's about creating this nice sense of balance, especially when we are considering 3D mixing. So if we scroll through this track, we see that the important elements like the synth and the lead guitar are quite high up in the mix. And then we have other things like the effects returns that are mixed quite low. You can see that the peak levels of these flutes, which are playing more of a supportive role and more for color against the lead elements, are quite a bit lower than, say, this important synth right here, which is peaking at about -15. And the drums over here are peaking a little bit low, but they are well represented in the mix and kind of sitting back a little bit as if the other instruments are in front of the drums. And speaking of drums, perhaps we can focus on them for the concept of depth that I will mention next. And that is the importance of top end for perceived depth. If things are closer to you, then the high-end frequencies are able to travel through the air and reach your ears. And as things move further away, the friction of the media, typically air, will cause these high frequencies to dull out before they can reach our ears. So to make things sound closer, we can use high shelf boosts, and to make things sound further away, we can use high shelf cuts. So I will typically boost the top end on things like snare to help push them forward a little bit in the mix. We can see this here on the SSL channel strip that I have 5 dB shelf at 8K. So let's open up the other snares as well, and I will toggle these high ends on and off and even turn them down a little bit so we can hear the effect, at least on the snare, that a top shelf will have on the perceived distance of the instrument. So not only does it make it quieter, which pushes it back in the mix, but it also makes it sound duller, which makes it sound further away from us. I use high shelving on a lot of different instruments. Let's go find something else perhaps, like this synth. We can see that I have a 7.3 dB boost, again at this 8K. Let's listen to this and toggle it on and off. And you can hear that because I spent all this time affecting the sides information, particularly in the upper mid-range, that when I have a high shelf boost on this synth, it really brings out that side information. And when I take it off, it really centers the synth that much more in the mix. Let's have another listen here. So in this case, it moves that synth closer to us, but it also enhances the width, again, because of the processing that we have going on afterward. Another tool we have for depth is, of course, reverb. So reverb is an effect that aims to reproduce the effects of reverberation in the real world. So right now I'm in my studio. It's about 150 square feet. I've got acoustic paneling, but even still, when I am speaking, my voice is emanating from my mouth. It's hitting my computer screen. It's hitting the walls, bouncing around the room, and then coming back to my ears. And so all of these reflections culminate together to add a sense of reverb. Now, if a sound source is close to us, we will hear a lot of that direct sound because we're so close, and we will hear less, relatively speaking, of the reflections around the room or the acoustic space. As we move away from that sound source, not only will the direct sound get quieter as we are further away and the sound has further to travel, but the relative level of the reflections and the reverb of the acoustic space will increase relative to that direct sound. So we can send audio from tracks to an effects return that has a reverb on it as a way to create a sense of acoustic space within the mix. And while I don't use too much reverb in my mixes personally, I will often use a snare plate. So right here we have our two snare tracks, and they are both being sent to bus 12. Bus 12 is our snare plate right here. I have the little plate set up here. This is a EMT 140 emulation. This is by Sound Toys, and I have a little bit of EQ just to pull out some of that mid-range boxiness. And what this does is it just adds a little bit of ambience to the drums. So it doesn't necessarily push the snare further away, but it does add a sense of cohesiveness to the drums. Another way of doing that is to have a room microphone, which is a microphone literally placed further away from the kit. Let's have a listen to these drums, and I'll mute and unmute this room as well. So that's a way to get a sense of space within the mix, but to really push things back and to demo this, we'll go back to this trusty synth right here, and we will have a listen to it in solo at the end of the track. And what I actually do here is, instead of sending this to an effects return that has a reverb on it, I actually have a reverb directly on the channel. Now, I don't usually advise doing this, but in this case, it's for a special effect and it's being automated. So if I open up the automation here, let's drag this mixer down and we will go to Pro R Mix. So I'm using the FabFilter Pro R right here. You can see I have some EQ, and then I have these settings right here. And what you see here is I have a mix of 3% throughout the majority of the song, which means that the actual effect that this plugin is producing is only 3% of the output of that plugin. So this synth audio right here is coming through the gain, through the SSL channel into the Pro R. It's getting affected by this reverb, but most of what this plugin is outputting is the dry signal. Now, as this automation goes up, we will eventually reach a point where the mix is 100%, in which case this plugin is only outputting the reverb effect and no dry signal. So let's start right here. We'll have a listen to this synth in the context of the mix, and you'll hear it progressively get further and further away from the listener as the mix goes on. I think that this is a great way of showing the effect of reverb on the perception of depth within the mix by having some automation here. And we're kind of combining two parts that I've spoken about in this demo, where we are not only adding reverb to the signal, but by the EQ right here, we're also cutting away some of that top end. So we are using the top end EQ cut as well as reverb to really push that synth further back in the mix. Another strategy, and the final one that we will talk about in this video, is using compression to bring things closer or further away from the mix. So let's go back to our snare quickly. We have the CLA 76 right here. This is one of my favorite compressors. It's a FET or FET compressor. And what I have here is a super fast release and a slow attack. So what this is doing with the snare is it's allowing the snare transient to pop through, and then it's quickly clamping down on it. So this compressor is effectively shaping the transient to make the snare more punchy, more in your face, and closer to the listener. So let's have a listen to that in the context of the mix, and I will turn this on and off so that we can hear the difference. So it just helps pull that snare closer to the listener and makes it more present within the mix. Now, this is with a slow attack, so again, we're kind of shaping that transient, allowing the initial attack to go through before the compressor clamps down to bring things closer, but we can also use a very fast attack to push things further in the mix. A better demo compression being able to push things further back in the mix would be the drum room. So I will open up this CLA 76, the same compressor that we were just using, but you see here that the release and the attack are all the way up. So as soon as a transient hits, this compressor is going to slam down and compress it. And we also have a significant amount of compression happening in the SSL channel right here. We have a ratio of about 6, our threshold at negative 15.9, and again, a very fast release and a fast attack. So let's have a listen. I'll toggle both of these on and off, and we can hear how the drum room signal will come forward a little bit when I turn these off, and then we can push it back by having this compression going on. As well as, I should mention that I'm taking quite a bit off in the high end. I have a roll off here at 8.6K. So let's have a listen. I'll toggle these on and off. So you hear just with compression, we are pushing the drums further back in the mix. And now if I bring in even more compression before this compressor with this low pass filter, we can push it that much further. So even though the level matching isn't perfect and turning these plugins on actually increases the perceived volume a little bit, we can still hear that this compression and EQ pushes these drums a bit further back in the mix. All right, so that's what I have for you in terms of 3D mixing and the strategies that I use to go about creating three-dimensional mixes. All right, I hope that demonstration of 3D mixing was helpful for you. If you'd like to learn more about mixing, I have a free mixing guidebook. It will be the first link in the description box down below. Click on that, sign up to my newsletter, and get access to my workflow where I'll take you step by step through the mixing process to help you make the right moves at the right times for better mixes and more consistent mixes. If you'd like more free content here on the YouTube channel, I would encourage you to hit that subscribe button and to also check out another few of these videos up here in the top left and right corner. Click on one of those, check them out, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.